Hi, welcome to Global Supply Chain Week. I'm JT Engstrom with FreightWaves. Joining me today is Jamie Dixon, Director of Supply Chain at XAct Solutions, which is now backed by TM Insight. Jamie, it's a pleasure to have you join us.
Great to be here, JT. Thank you very much.
And now you're dialing in from overseas. Can you tell the audience a little bit about where you are right now?
Yeah, sure. So I'm dialing in from Australia. I'm dialing in from a city called Melbourne, which is the second largest city in Australia. It's 9:30 in the morning here, and I think it's late in the afternoon where you are, JT. But great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great, and we appreciate you dialing in for this discussion, which will focus largely on final mile. I think will be really interesting for the audience. I think with that, you also had the benefit of watching the Super Bowl in the morning, which must have been nice. And so with that, we really appreciate you dialing in. So thank you very much for that. Can we start by talking a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I must say I did watch the Super Bowl yesterday morning here in Melbourne, and it was great to watch. It was a great game. Would have been nice to have been a little bit closer, but I really enjoy the game.
Yeah, that Brady is something else.
Yeah, so just a bit about my background. Thanks, JT. So I'm a director, as you say, at XAct Solutions in the supply chain area. My focus is on the freight and logistics space. I've been with XAct Solutions for nearly 13 years in consulting and been involved with probably over 200 projects with a number of blue chip and other clients around Australia and the Asia Pacific region. We've done a lot of projects in the final mile and last mile space. I think there's some really exciting things happening in that area. Prior to working for XAct Solutions, I worked for a large telecommunications company for 5 years in procurement and supply chain, and prior to working for that company, Telstra, I worked for a major third-party logistics and freight cartage contract company for a number of years, and I've also got a little bit of education studying transport economics and also an executive MBA. So I've been involved in the industry for a long time, and it's a really exciting time to be involved, particularly in the final mile space.
That's for sure. And it'll set us up for a really rich discussion, especially considering what the last 12 months have materialized into. Final mile was already interesting before that, but has become increasingly interesting as a result of some of the health dynamics across the world and the explosion in e-commerce as a result. Before we jump into that, can you tell us a little bit about XAct and some of the work you all do?
Yeah, sure. So XAct Solutions is a supply chain consultancy, and we recently partnered with another company called TM Insight. So we're actually bringing the two businesses together. And with the two businesses coming together, we've got over 120 staff based around Australia Pacific. Obviously, our foundation is in Australia, in both Melbourne and Sydney. But in recent years, we've spread our business out to Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Japan, New Zealand, and other parts of Asia Pacific. And we focus on supply chain strategies, freight and logistics outcomes for our customers, and also involved in industrial property and project services as well. So we're one of the major professional services supply chain consulting companies in this part of the world. And yeah, it's great to be involved in the technologies and the developments that have been happening in this final mile space, and really also interested in understanding more about what's going on outside of Asia Pacific and the trends that are happening across America and also in Europe as well.
Yeah. So with that, why don't we jump into a bit about final mile? Do you want to start off by talking a little bit about some of the semi-recent evolutions of final mile? It has become increasingly a focus of operators and investors, and clearly the end consumer as well. Can you talk to us a bit about kind of where it's come from, and then we'll use that as a baseboard to talk about where it is right now?
Yeah, I think, JT, sort of leading organisations were very focused on the last mile and the final mile over the last couple of years, particularly with the technologies and the ability to control the operating model much better in that last mile space. And companies are really focused on that customer experience is another key driver of that key focus on the final mile and the last mile. And I think that obviously the COVID-19 has had a massive impact all around the world, and we haven't been immune here in Australia. There's been a significant impact in the last 12 months, and we've seen an absolute explosion in the e-commerce world, and then obviously that's a significant impact on the final mile. And what we've seen, I mean, a great example of the companies down here would be our major postal organisation, Australia Post, is a significant player in the e-commerce world, and their volumes have gone up since COVID by 84%, which is really interesting. And that's just one business that's operating that space. But there's really been a significant shift. And so if we see leading organisations in this part of the world, and I'm sure across the globe, have really been proactive in trying to respond to that surge in volumes and that surge in demand, and ultimately trying to provide a fantastic customer experience to that final customer and final consumer. So we've absolutely seen that shift and that focus. As I said, JT, it's a really exciting time to be in this space, because when you overlay the experience of the businesses and leading organisations and the technologies and the ability to control and deliver optimisation outcomes, it's great to be involved, and it's great to see what's happening around the globe, and very exciting times. And coming out of COVID-19, we're hopefully largely, fingers crossed, coming out of it here in this part of the world to a large extent. But the new normal is going to be what we need to understand in terms of that final mile, what's it going to look like, and it's going to be a significant part of the freight and logistics components going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is it was a really significant trend prior to COVID-19, but during COVID-19, as everyone went down on either lockdown or some form of relative seclusion, social distancing, the demand for final mile or at-home delivery really exploded. And so the distribution networks, whether it's the storage or the actual rolling stock assets, really saw significant upticks in demand all around the world, which is really, truly phenomenal. With that, understanding that, the last leg of final mile, the final leg of final mile involves an actual asset, and as a result, capital allocation decisions for operators. Realizing the explosion in growth over the past year or so, how do you think operators should be thinking about navigating the next 12 months in terms of whether or not to grow their asset bases or remain disciplined and try to drive asset utilization, or perhaps just be more efficient with their networks and or incentivize their shipping counterparts to either seek to gain more visibility further up front and or have different inventory stocking levels? How do you think about keeping up with such an explosive growth and demand?
Yeah, it's a great question, JT. And obviously, as I said, we've really got to understand what that new normal looks like from an explosive growth perspective. And we've really got to focus on that customer experience. And I think organisations and shippers around the place really understand what that operating model needs to look like in terms of asset ownership, like who owns the asset, who's controlling the asset, and what's the technology that wraps around to ensure that you're optimising the utilisation of your assets. What we've seen in this part of the world is in that e-commerce last mile space, there's probably been a challenge around the cost to serve being quite significant for businesses and for shippers, and then ensuring that they can recover the costs against that operating model and they can optimise the utilisation of their assets. So it's obviously working out what's the right number of assets that you need, what are the right size vehicles, what sort of fuel technologies you're able to employ with those sorts of vehicles, what sort of sustainability perspectives are driving that, and then where are you holding inventory, and then how can you get the best outcome from a customer experience service perspective against those orders that are coming through. We often see that companies may be fulfilling orders from several different locations, whether it be from a distribution centre, whether it be from the store, whether it be from a sort of urban fulfilment type centre. How can they respond to customer demand and still satisfy the customer and avoid having, one of the big challenges that we're seeing here, and I'm sure is an issue around the globe, is what we call split orders, where you see, you might order 5 garments from the one retailer, for example, and it might come in 3 different deliveries. A couple of garments from the store, one from the distribution centre, and one from somewhere else. So these sorts of challenges that companies are facing, they really need to be very clear on the operating model and the utilisation of the assets, and then how do they control and optimise those assets, JT?
Yeah, that's interesting. And as you think about future evolutions of the space, what are some of the biggest game changers that you think will prevail, or what are some of the largest secular themes you're seeing in the space?
Yeah, well, I think we talk a lot about control towers here. I think that's something that's a significant opportunity for businesses and shippers alike going forward. I think if you can set up a centralised type control centre that is backed by really good information and really good event management technology and optimisation technology, I think that's going to be that's really the game changer. I think, JT, in terms of companies being more sophisticated to get those fulfilment algorithms right, to get the right utilisation and the right optimisation of the vehicle assets, and also from a sustainability perspective. So if you've got that end-to-end control, if you've got that end-to-end visibility, you're very much able to offer proactive customer service to your customers. If things aren't going perfect, and we all know in the world of logistics, things don't always go exactly how we'd like them to go from a service and control perspective. So if you've really got your finger on the pulse from a technology perspective, you've got that information at your fingertips, and you're able to communicate effectively with your customers, it all adds up to a much better overall final mile experience.
Yeah, that's right. And clearly there's been a significant amount of investment in the space as well, whether through raw startups, cold startups, or actual acquisition takeovers. Certainly over here stateside, it's been a really hyped area in terms of existing platforms seeking to get further and further into final mile and cross-sell their entire book of business. So it'll be very unique to see who best takes the control position over those game changers, if you will. And so broadly speaking, what are some of the technologies that you're keeping an eye on that you think can shape and form the way the space evolves over the near term?
Well, I think that starts with the fulfillment technology. So having a system that is able to understand from a planning and from a supply and demand perspective where your inventory is being manufactured, where your inventory is coming from, and then controlling that through your distribution centres and through your logistics flows to then enable it to be in the right position to fulfil that customer experience most effectively. So, in a country the size of Australia, which is actually a very similar geographical size to the United States, for example, with a much smaller population, it's absolutely critical to have your inventory close to your customer and close to your market, but not at the expense of additional storage charges, for example. So the technology that's able to enable that fulfillment, I think, is really important. Getting the algorithm right in terms of where you're fulfilling from a distribution centre versus a store versus another centre, and then having the optimised assets from a transport technology perspective to deliver on that. So I think the route optimisation tools, a lot of the tools are quite similar, provided the right information is coming in and the right information is going out. But I think that's critical for shippers and leading organisations to really consider having that technology in terms of optimising the assets, getting the fulfilment right, and then having an overall platform that can control that from an end-to-end visibility, as I said, having the dashboards in place to really understand the events and where your assets are and getting the optimization out of those assets, and also the sustainability perspective as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's remarkable. And so for those either currently operating in the space or thinking of penetrating the space, what recommendations do you have, whether it be both for operators and for investors?
Look, I think you've got to consider what the customer experience needs to look like. I think you've got to consider your end-to-end operating model and your supply chain network. So if you understand your supply chain network, you understand what the customer requirements are and the business requirements are, then you can build an operating model around that in terms of the assets that are required, whether you own the assets or you outsource the assets is obviously a consideration, and then what that operating model looks like in terms of the best utilisation. One of the trends that we're seeing that's happening here, and to some extent I think we're lagging behind some of the other countries around the world, is as I said, getting closer to the customer, having urban fulfillment type centres, and then delivering, utilising your assets to the best capability to deliver on that customer experience.
Yeah, and that's a tremendous overview from top to bottom. I think before we sign off, are there any final thoughts that you would advise the audience to be thinking about, or trends that you would be pointing out that you really want to underscore that you think are important to keep top of mind?
Yeah, thanks, JT. Look, I think companies just need to be cognizant of that cost and service trade-off with a view to satisfying customer experience to the best of your ability, but then making sure that you can optimise your logistics operations, you can control the logistics operations, and enabling that by best-in-class technology. So I think that's the objective that organisations need to focus on, and happy that they get that outcome, and minimise some of the issues and the challenges that we're all facing in terms of inefficiency in supply chain.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's great advice, and certainly something everyone should be keeping top of mind. And so with that, we're to a closure. Jamie, it was a pleasure to have you join us. We hope you join us again soon, and thank you for your time.
No, thank you very much. It was great to be involved, and all the best, and talk to you soon. Thank you very much, JT.
Absolutely. So with that, Jamie Dixon, Director of Supply Chain at XAct Solutions. I'm JT Engstrom with FreightWaves. Thank you all for joining in.